first I want to ask you the hard question. I just want to get it out of the
Yep.
way. What is your favorite
Sure.
Bible story? I know.
Oh my gosh. Um, Let me think actually. I want to give you a good answer. Um, so there's several that populate my mind actually. I've been doing a lot of contemplation as of late on Genesis 5, and particularly the gender specific nouns and pronouns in the original Hebrew for the creation narrative of Adam. You know it. Oh, whew, okay. I wasn't expecting this to be the first question, but I dig it. I like it. I like it. I like it. We'll jump right in. In short, I'm exploring a hypothesis that so far seems to be reflected in rabbinical texts going all the way into antiquity. That the concept of humanity, of Adam, which Adam is, it's a generic placeholder noun for the human kind. Um, that the nature of Adam is one of a unity and harmony between both a male and a female essence, and that it's a consequence of this mythic fall. And again, there's, of course, a multiplicity of ways to interpret what is meant by the fall that is expressed in Genesis, but that a consequence of that fall is the fracturing of the male and the female essence in every instantiation of the human person. And therefore, one of the spiritual imperatives in our growth and our development is the reharmonization of a masculine and a feminine essence that are intrinsic to each person.
I like that. And I have spent a little bit of time in the last couple of days sort of catching up on some of the interviews you have online. And part of me thinks that we may end up way out in left field from what I really wanted to sit down and talk. And that's awesome because I think we have some
Okay.
strange intersections of our background. I grew up in a Pentecostal church and spent some time figuring out my own understanding of what the hell happened to me because I had some really toxic stuff as a kid. And it may be best to start there. I actually was thinking we should jump right into the study, except that your background may inform a lot of what maybe spawned this. So maybe it's worth asking you first, what made you chase this field of research? What made you interested in this as opposed to all the things you could have gone and got your PhD for?
These are, you ask very big questions, but these are welcome. I like the big questions. I can honestly trace the early roots of my intellectual thirsting with regard to spirituality and its intersection with science all the way back to my early years in Sunday school as a little kid. I grew up in the LDS church, more commonly it's known as the Mormon church. And probably around the age of 7 or 8, there was this Sunday school lesson where the teacher was talking about the spirit and the human spirit. And the metaphor that the teacher used was this object lesson where they had a hand and they had a glove on their hand. And they said, okay, the glove is like your body, the hand is like your spirit. When death occurs, it's the spirit leaving the body. And that, as a little 7 or 8 year old, that just blew my mind. And like literally from that point forward, I just had this gnawing question: what is spirit? What is spirit? And that that thirst to understand that concept of quote unquote spirit is one that has been unabated over my lifetime, and if anything has only grown, and it's taken me in a lot of different directions that, as a 7 or 8 year old, there's no way I could have anticipated.
Yeah.
um, I took my spiritual life and my spiritual commitments very, very seriously growing up. Um, we can unpack that as much as you'd like to, but suffice for now to say that even when I went through a faith crisis and a period of disillusionment with the religion of my upbringing, I couldn't deny that I had phenomenological history. I had experience where I perceived something and felt something that seemed more real than physical sensory experience.
Yeah.
And I mean, to this day, I still have this question, like, what was that?
Yeah.
And that that question of trying to understand, narrate, and harmonize my personal experiences with a neuroscientific material Western paradigm
Mhm.
is one of the things that drove the study at the University of Utah and that continues to drive a lot of my current work.
Yeah, so it sounds like there has been some new updates in that, but that goes right to the study itself. Can you tell us about the study and specifically what I'm interested in here is the intricacy in setting this thing up? It sounds like you were measuring all sorts of things because you took the time ahead of time to figure out how could we. So it sounds like there was connectivity between different brain regions. There was how much trust is involved at different times in one session. There was feelings of the spirit, and that actually, when I was looking at the breakdown, was measured in a number of different ways because it appears that you actually had participants define a little bit whether it was a burning or a rumbling. I think those neither of those words were probably in it, but what sort of feeling they were getting. So can you tell us about the experiment and specifically what in the world's going on in the brains of, in this case, Mormons is who you've studied, when they are having what
That's
they
right.
refer to as a religious experience?
You bet. Great questions. So, one of the first things to be aware of is the fact that fMRI studies are so expensive. The functional magnetic resonance imaging tool in neuroscience is wonderful. We're able to peek inside the brain and see what is happening with activity in very specific regions when very nuanced experiences are taking place. Um, so because it's such an expensive modality, we really wanted to get the most information as possible from each of the sessions that we had with our, very gracious research participants. Um, and I guess two of the paradigms that I'll focus on right now in our conversation were trying to capture the basic neural architecture for this experience that in Mormonism and Mormon LDS culture, it's referred to as feeling the spirit, and that's a phrase that I think is, pretty ubiquitous across different denominations and different religions. Um, Within Mormonism, that's something that, I mean, if you go to any Mormon worship service, multiple times you'll hear people say, "Oh, I felt the spirit. Oh, I was really feeling the spirit. Oh, I feel the spirit in this meeting," et cetera, et cetera. And there's always this question of like, okay, are they just buffaloing one another here? Are they, is there really anything going on under the hood? Or has this just become a pluralistic ignorance paradigm, to use a term of art, where, everybody has just kind of like, with a wink and a nod, agreed to use a term and pretend like something is happening. Yeah, exactly. So we wanted to see, okay, can we show in the brain statistically significant physiological participation in this reported phenomenon of quote unquote feeling spirit? And in order to do that, when we had these research participants go into the brain scanner, they engaged in prayer. They read scriptures from holy texts. In this particular context, it was the Book of Mormon. They watched videos of sermons from leaders in their church who they esteem as prophetic and apostolic. So, in other words, they have a very high religious um, esteem for the individuals whose sermons they were watching. And they had a button box that was attached to their chest while they were praying or while they were reading scriptures or while they were watching these videos of spiritual content. And they would push a button every time that they were feeling the spirit. So there was a degree of flexibility in the paradigm, in the sense that, we weren't just looking at a fixed time point of, okay, every time that this face of, this leader flashes on the screen, we're going to look at that exact fixed moment at what's happening in the brain. It was really guided by the individual's self-report.
Okay.
And when we went back through and looked at each of those time points that were affiliated with a button press, or in other words, with a self-report of quote unquote feeling the spirit, we were so excited by the result. It turned out that every time that an individual reported to be feeling the spirit, that the nucleus accumbens, which is an integral part in the reward system, came online with an increased level of activity. If it was something super random and bizarre, like, oh, this little corner of the cerebellum came online and was more active, then we would be like, oh, we have no idea how to interpret that. But when it's an area of the brain that is so clearly involved in reward and in quite frankly, and in pathologies like addiction, that seemed very, very biologically plausible, in addition to being very statistically significant.
Yeah.
So that's baseline paradigm one. Do you want me to go ahead and charge forward
Yeah.
and talk
No,
about a
go.
second
Yeah.
major
If you're on a roll, because I think there's more you could say without me interrupting you. So go ahead.
Okay. So a second major paradigm was more of a behavioral assessment. So again, keep in mind the first one, it was really a neurophysiological assessment. We were asking the question of where in the brain is the spirit tickling the nervous system, if you will. The second one was this behavioral question. And we wanted to know whether or not there was a degree of authority bias in the self-reports of religious significance and spiritual meaning. So we had a series of quotes, teachings, spiritual statements that were from a variety of sources. Half of them were from LDS sources, so in-group religious authority figures. Half of them were from out-group religious authority figures, Billy Graham, Desmond Tutu, Pope Francis. And the individuals participating in this experimental paradigm were shown a quote. They saw who was the person who made this statement, and then they were asked to rank subjectively how meaningful is this to you and how strongly are you feeling the spirit as you contemplate this teaching. Well, so since we're scientists, we're tricksters. And there was a little bit of a twist that we didn't tell the participants, namely that none of the quotes were actually from the attributed sources. All of the quotes were really from collections of writings by Clive Staples Lewis, C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
And they were randomized. So each time that we had a subject come in, it was a random assignment as to which quote was paired with which attributed source. So one day the very same quote for a subject could be attributed to the Mormon prophet. Another day that very same quote could be attributed to the Catholic Pope. So in other words, we were trying to control for anything that was intrinsic to the quotes themselves that could have been a variable driving a difference in report, and really just trying to isolate the variable of who they thought was giving the teaching. Okay, so result number one was, as you might not be surprised to hear, if an LDS individual was told that a particular teaching was from their religious leader, then they were more likely to report that this was a very meaningful spiritual statement, that they were having a strong religious emotional response to it. And if it was a teaching that they were told was from someone outside of the religious community, they were more likely to say, this is not spiritually meaningful, and I'm not having a spiritual religious emotional response to this.
Yeah. And
That's
so one
Go
of the
ahead.
question that, since we're at that point anyway, I hadn't thought about this before, but did you have any talk of switching out one of the out of group leaders with somebody more, again, speaking it from a Christian background, more dangerous? I could see like Osama bin Laden being somebody that you may have attributed a quote to. Or did you notice any difference between the specific people? I know all of them you mentioned are pretty generic. They're actually, they're all three still Christians, right? So they're just
Yep,
outside
that's
Mormon,
right.
but also other Christian organizations. So I know that's
That's
sort of
right.
off
No,
the
now
wall question, but was that a consideration at all to maybe trigger a complete outsider amygdala? Oh God, I've been told that person is poison, to see if maybe you did see that.
Yeah, that's a great question. We did consider a bunch of different controls and a bunch of different variables, and that would be a really, really interesting follow-up study to go, so far as someone who is, within the cultural context identified as not just outsider, but hostile enemy. Yeah, let's do that study.
Yeah, right.
Do that
Let's
as a
get it put together. Cool.
goal.
And that actually wasn't even on my list of questions. My thought is, so what you're giving us is this example, or this metaphor of part of the brain lighting up that's related to reward. And any of us that have had a real religious experience, I don't think that's that surprising to us, even though we might not want to admit it. But there were some other parts of the brain that also lit up that I saw in the study. And you've used the term in the past, use something a little bit different just a few minutes ago, but along the lines of neurospiritual pathway of Mormonism. So I was wondering if you
Yep.
could maybe pull that term apart and explain what that might have to do with whether or not universal religious experiences are a thing. Because I get the impression that you're not actually saying all Mormons even feel the same thing, but rather that you could probably see similar networks light up. But that doesn't mean we don't all have subjective differences in what's going on. So I know that's a really long question, but what I guess I'm asking is, what do you make of?
Yeah, no, you're great. You're great. So yes, there's more to the story. It's not only the nucleus accumbens. The two other regions that were implicated were the medial prefrontal cortex of the brain, and I'll break that down in a second because I know that that's a pretty specific anatomical term, and then also frontal attention regions. So with the medial prefrontal cortex of the brain, it does a lot of stuff, and one of the things that we really try to avoid is the reverse inference. So in other words, when you see a particular area of the brain that becomes active, well, there's a lot of different reasons why it could be active. And we want to be really careful to not assert more confidence than we actually have. So we have, several speculative hypotheses about what is the cognitive role that corresponds to this activation of the medial prefrontal cortex. So for example, value-based judgments. We have seen in a variety of neural imaging studies that when someone has to evaluate something for, its moral content, or to make any type of assessment about the intrinsic worth of something, that the medial prefrontal cortex comes online when you're making those sorts of value or moral assessments. So that could be one reason why there was activity that was spiking. If individuals were seeing things like family or sacred iconography for which they had a very high level of assigned value, that could be something that was driving that particular region of the brain. The other area that we saw with regard to feeling the spirit was the frontal attention region of the brain. And when someone is focusing on something, you can think of this as sort of a signal boost. Like if you got an amp, you could be playing an acoustic guitar, but if you really want to boost that signal and make it louder, you plug it into an amplifier. And in some ways, the frontal attention regions can serve that type of a function, to where there can be something happening in the brain phenomenologically. You could be having a baseline reward response at a neural level. Then if those frontal attention regions come on, they can boost that signal and make you more aware of it. And so it can be experienced by the individual as a more pronounced conscious event. The reason why, when I've talked about this, I specify it as a Mormon specific neurospiritual pathway, is because it is an open question for us about whether, if you took someone, let's just say, Pentecostals, that when they're having an experience like speaking in tongues, certainly the brain is doing something that is unique to that conscious state that it's probably not doing in the same way if you're engaging in normal speech. It doesn't necessarily mean, though, that same triad of regions that we saw in the LDS population of nucleus accumbens, medial prefrontal cortex, and frontal attention regions are the same series of brain regions that are being heightened in their activity levels if someone from a Pentecostal faith is speaking in tongues. Yeah. And so this pushes us toward what I think is a really, really critical question for understanding religion and spirituality at the level of the brain. And that is the degree to which these are experiences that are hard baked into our biology. In other words, did we as a species evolve with a selective pressure biasing us toward these experiences? Or are these largely socially specific, kind of culturally created experiences where it's almost like culture figured out a way to repurpose machinery that was already in the brain and that had evolved for a different functional reason?
Yeah, and I want to flag that and not get too far away from it, because I think we're both, one of the things I love about your style is that you seem to incorporate evolutionary biology theories sort of seamlessly. And it's something that the social sciences are sort of having to pick up, because students have missed a lot of this and they don't understand what we're even talking about when we talk about evolutionary theory and how it plays in. So I want to come back to that specifically in the area of tribalism and how that may have been a big part of how we evolved. But before we move on from the areas, I know we're just hypothesizing, except even from your lit review in the beginning of the 2018 article, some of this research has been done, and you did this great job of sort of separating differences in religious experiences. I found myself thinking of the metaphor of walking into my Pentecostal church as a kid and finding before me a smorgasbord, or like a buffet, where there were people in the back that were experiencing religious experiences that you would find maybe up the street also at a Presbyterian church or a Methodist church, that were maybe chanting to themselves and they were slow, and all of those regions were lit up. And then there was me and my people in the front dancing and speaking in tongues, and we basically had turned huge portions of our brain off. I haven't figured out a better term than mindless meditation, but the science shows that we fire our nucleus accumbens up a little bit, and then we just put everything on autopilot. I would almost wonder what your hypothesis would be on what some of the other differences were, or if you would see these same consistencies if you were to put somebody from either, we keep talking about Pentecostal because it's me, so I'm fine with that. What sorts of differences
Yeah.
would you see in religious experiences for you if you were to slide them into the MRI in place?
Yeah, no, and this is so interesting. I've got so many speculations. I'll try to not go too crazy with my speculations here.
Yeah.
But I think that, one cultural variable that would be very worth exploring is the cultural variable of a personal versus an impersonal source of the sacred. So, whether it's a personal God or whether it's more of like an impersonal Tao. We understand from cultural anthropology that, as you're alluding to here, so much of our form and our function as Homo sapiens has to do with attachment. It has to do with trust. It has to do with altruism, that, we have these instincts where we will be self-sacrificial for the group or for the sacred totems of the group. That to me leads into a very plausible perspective that having a deity or having a source of the sacred that you view as personal and you view as relational could engage the brain in a different way than a source of transcendent divine sacrality that is impersonal, that is more of a force than a relational personality. Yeah, right now, one of the things that I'm actively working on is modeling the spiritual personality. So there is some very, very good work that's been done by Robert Cloninger with a measure that's called the temperament character inventory. And he's trying to understand variations in individual personalities that have some sort of an evolutionary basis in them. So, things like reward versus risk aversion. He has an entire domain of self-transcendence. And in that domain of self-transcendence, he's really seeking for things that are universal, and that could be universal building blocks feeding forward into these culturally specific and personally specific variations that we see. And so, one of the constructs that I'm looking at right now is a domain called spiritual acceptance. So the propensity of an individual to say yes to propositions that are metaphysical in nature, or that don't have a strong material evidential basis for them. And then to pin those down to, like, are there ways that we can look at brain circuits that are biasing individuals one way or another in these directions?
Yeah, I think that actually, I wouldn't be surprised if in that research we sort of, again, meet with realizing that certain people are maybe predisposed to appreciate different neural spiritual pathways of different sorts of religious experiences. And maybe I mean, most of it in our culture just has to do with the luck of the draw. We're raised by caregivers that teach us truths that, you know, we just take as truth. And the majority of people that practice religion, if they really have it at their roots, they get it at a young age. But it does make me wonder, as you sort of unpack this, if that's some of the connections you'll start to find. If there's genetic predispositions to people that say enjoy Pentecostal spiritual experiences more than other brands or more than other types, and if it has some
That's
very
right.
real
So,
physical
and
basis.
yes, and to bring this, you know, maybe toward a speculative, unified perspective of cultural variation and biological variation. You know,
Mhm.
I wouldn't be surprised
Yeah.
if, given a few more decades of this work, if we recognize that variations in cultural expression are ultimately motifs that are recapitulating these variations in biological expression, such that you had, you know, for whatever historical reasons, some individuals with a particular biological predisposition who were in positions of power or authority, and that they were the ones basically setting the pace or setting the template for a particular value expression within a culture. And so naturally, you know, they're gonna, if they're the one making the recipe, they're gonna make it according to their
Yeah,
preference.
yeah, and they want to make
And
sure, right, that their kids also hold on to the power. It sounds like you're describing the history of the United States, although it goes way back farther than that. But yeah, yeah, interesting way of describing. No shit, the people that have the power make the rules, and they don't make rules that are guaranteed to push them out of power the next day. They reinforce their power, which means they reinforce the normacy of whatever that type is. And our culture, it's the, you know, 6'1" heterosexual Christian man that weighs between 160 and 80 pounds and is between 18 and 35 type thing. So I think that's a
yeah,
good
and so I
tie-in.
mean, as we move forward and as we have a wider band of cultural exchange, even on topics of spirituality and religiosity, I do wonder if the next century isn't necessarily going to be a flagging of spiritual motivation, but rather a resorting of spiritual matches, to where, you know, now individuals are able to access cultural motifs that are just more naturally fit to their
Yeah.
intrinsic neurobiological orientation.
Yeah. Well, and I think we're already seeing it. My experience growing up in the church was well, I'm an addicted person. So that in and of itself was enough to mean that I was classified as somebody who, my body type was a sin if it was acting up at the time. And especially in the 80s and 90s, that we didn't really have we didn't look at addiction the way we do now. And we still have a lot of work to do. So that's what I think about a lot, is that now I look at what I've called like the capitalism of religious experience, that my church has been split not just once or twice or 10 times, but that literally in like this Foucauldian style of how power works, it is segmented and segmented and segmented. And then the people in the new congregation have an argument and they don't agree on something. Nowadays, it's a lot easier to find churches that are accepting of identities that in the 90s, I was just led to believe like, no, it's never going to happen. Here's the verse that can only be read one way, my way, right? Like whoever was reading it
Yeah.
to me was also translating it. And it is interesting to see. I think you're right. We've already seen a lot of this with, I live in a major city in Denver, and there's churches called like a scum of the earth church and non-denominational churches that you would have a hard time putting your finger on what their doctrine is, but it's the result of people seeking out something very similar to what they had as a kid or what they're wanting with their religious experience, and they don't have it at their restaurant or at their church up the street. So I think we're already there.
Yeah. And, you know, I'll say also that there is a part of me, both at a personal level as well as at a level of scientific inquiry, that is hungry for universals.
Yeah.
Because, yes, like, definitely we see so much wonderful diversity in biology, wonderful diversity in culture. Yet there is a part of me, both intellectually and I would even say spiritually, that craves something that is a consistent through line, that is culturally invariant, that is temporally invariant. And this is one of the reasons why I'm very taken by historical mystical literature. You can read the writings of a mystic from a Sufi Muslim background the writings of a mystic from a far Eastern Taoist background, the writings of a mystic from a 16th century Spanish Catholic background. And when you do a comparative reading across these periods of time and across these cultural expressions, you start to see forms that are very correlated with one another. And to me, that does very provocatively point toward this hypothesis of natural religion or natural spirituality that does transcend the varieties of forms that have emerged for a multiplicity.
So danger is what my youth pastor's saying right now. It's what every Christian I grew up with. So that makes me want to ask you the question: how much pushback? I actually want to ask this in a way that says not just from others, but maybe from yourself, knowing how I internalized a lot of my religious identity as a kid. How much pushback have you run into in trying to demystify what a lot of people in my youth were convinced and determined that the last thing that they were interested in was anybody trying to delegitimize? I don't agree with those words, by the way. I don't think that classifying and understanding something, I think it's the opposite. I think that when we understand just how, quote, fearfully and wonderfully made we are, there shouldn't be any fear there. But have you run into people that are just like, absolutely not, what are you doing? You are the enemy, you're going to ruin something?
Yeah, definitely. No, it's pretty wild also reading, some of the things that are said about my research in kind of a conspiratorial sense where, I think that my favorite was that, Dr. Ferguson and his research aspires to implant electrodes in the human brain for mind control, and, that they're trying to understand how religion operates so that they can create a regime of automatons. And I'm like, wow, you really went somewhere with your your speculation of where this could go. For the most part, though, I have been very pleasantly surprised even by the amount of positive responses that I've gotten from individuals on what I'll call, two extremes of the same spectrum. Folks from, a very deep commitment to secular humanism, as well as individuals from a place of very deep commitment to tradition-oriented religiosity. That when you have individuals who take their worldview seriously, then my personal experience is that they welcome inquiry, they welcome honest exploration, that it's more from people who aren't totally serious or who don't want to be bothered by taking the questions of worldview seriously, that they just think that this is kind of a waste of time.
Yeah, and my thought was, again, perspectives can vary a lot from religion to religion, even in the Christian denominations. But I think that the joy and the spiritual experience that I felt when I was really involved on a weekly basis, especially mixed with the social mingling and the feeling of I got people that got my back up, especially when I was young, sort of are what fueled me. They kept me going back there. And I know that as I look back now, I see what appears to me to have been fear or concern in the hearts of my superiors, my pastors and youth pastors, that if I realized there was another fountain right up the street that might be dispensing something very similar, I would find a false religion. I would stumble into the satanic temple and realize, I can get high. And that's the reason they don't like the word high. They don't like the word drugs. Honestly, I ran into this with myself when I started undertaking this. I was worried, even though you nailed it. I wanted to understand what the heck was going on because I knew it was real. And yet I still was really worried that I was going to figure out that something natural was going on. And I had to struggle with myself as well. So I know those are two related questions and I'm pushing a little bit, but what are your thoughts on that?
No, you're good. You're good. So a historical case study that comes to mind as you're talking is actually Juan de la Cruz. So this is an individual who was in, the 1500s in Spain, writing about very intimate, direct encounters with the divine, and experienced a lot of persecution. There was this whole thing called the Spanish Inquisition, and they weren't too fond of the notion that you could basically, in some ways, bypass a hierarchical authoritarian structure and go directly to the core mystery of being and reality yourself. fast forward a couple hundred years, and now suddenly that same individual who was being tortured by the Spanish Inquisition is recognized as a saint within that same religious organization. And so I think that time has a very funny way. I mean, not to say that torture is funny, because it's not, but time has a very paradoxical way of taking those things which initially seem the most threatening, and then in retrospect, celebrating them and esteeming them as the most prescient.
Yeah, you're right. And again, we're culturally centered. We're both living in the United States. And I know that's just been my cultural identity, but person after person in our history who suddenly become much more famous because they die. And we just saw Kobe Bryant pass away in this huge fanfare that shows up in everybody. He's suddenly their favorite athlete. But we can go back to Martin Luther King Jr. and John F. Kennedy, and the way that their narratives become twisted up with their deaths. So maybe there is something to that. And we sort of skipped around tribalism, but I am still interested in your take on how I'm the one throwing that word out. I know you didn't introduce it, but how does that maybe play into it? I'm going right to the introduction, which was really well written. I liked that it seemed like you must have polished this thing to say a lot sort of rhetorically under the radar. So I want to ask about it, but you pointed out let me just quote you, you mentioned the commonality between religion and romantic and parental love, as well as rewards and drug-induced euphoric states. But among rewarding stimuli, religious experience uniquely contributes to the establishment of social systems with far-reaching consequences for pro and antisocial behavior. Beautifully written. I don't know if you have an editor, but man, you need to give them a bonus. That was great. But I think that's exactly what you're getting at there. If you could add a little bit to that, or to help us understand what you meant by that statement, I think it'd help.
You bet. So, and this feeds again directly into work that we're about to submit for peer review right now. I'll tease the matter and say that the current findings are just driving deeper into this paradigm, that there is some very profound relationship between the selective pressures and the evolution of Homo sapiens for close, intimate bonds of trust, and the neurobiology that we're observing driving spiritual and religious orientations. So I mean, there's a lot that is contradictory out there right now that is trying to understand how this came to be in the first place and what its implications are. Using your term tribalism here, I mentioned that our behavioral observation with the LDS subject sample was that, okay, they had this bias where if it was their tribe, if it was someone who they recognized as an in-group member, that they were going to be more likely to say that whatever this person said was meaningful, it was valuable, it was important. Whatever someone from an out-group, out-tribe, to use that term, would say that was less valuable, less meaningful, less significant. Okay, so here is something that I found very, very provocative, and I'll even say unexpected. We actually did this same, in-tribe versus out-tribe source behavioral test at two different points of time. We had it at the beginning of their study session. Then for about 30 minutes or so, they were engaged in these spiritual tasks, reading scripture, praying, watching sermons by religious leaders. And then we did that same in-group, out-group assessment task after that 30 or so minutes of spiritual and religious priming. You might have already seen these results, but I'll just go ahead and throw it out to you. Like, what would you predict? Like, if you have an individual who spends 30 minutes or so really trying to gear up their spiritual system, will they be more in-group, more out-group, or will it be a neutral effect?
Honestly, it would be, I put myself again back in my own shoes as somebody deeply involved. I think that unless I mentioned Osama bin Laden earlier, just because he's who popped ahead into my mind. I think that in those moments, I would actually be much more inclined to trust anybody that was put in front of me unless I recognized them, because in the moment I would almost be caught in, Freud called it like this oceanic feeling of oneness, this wave of spirituality. I'm moving, I'm high, I'm in the moment, and it's going to take something for me to hit that wall. So my guess would have been that they would trust more. But I actually don't think that's the guess everybody would have. I don't think my religious experiences, I think it's a bit unique to me. So, what did you find?
Well, I'll tell you what I thought I was going to find. And I thought that I was going to find that having religious priming enhanced the tribal instinct.
Huh.
That, my guess is that they were going to be even more severe in their perceived hostility toward out-group members after religious priming. Yeah. But we saw exactly what you articulated just now, which is more expansiveness, more sense of oneness, that after they had this period of, quote unquote, feeling the spirit, they actually rated the out-group members more highly. They said that the things that were attributed to sources from different religious contexts were more meaningful. And so that also, it's one study. It needs to be replicated. We need to see if this generalizes. We need to see what the boundary conditions are. I think you bring up a really important one, which is the difference between, okay, you're out-group, but you're still within, some sort of nested identity association, as opposed to being an overt hostile force.
Right.
That said, given what we observed in this one study, it does make me curious about the degree to which our ability to not just transcend ourselves, but transcend our group identities is a feature and not just an accident in human nature.
Yeah. Wow. And that's a big connection. What we're talking about too is beyond just this idea of religion as a drug, but power. And in a lot of my classes, we come back to like, how does power work? And it's the most confusing and yet the simplest question, because it's everywhere. We're always caught in these power structures. But this is, again, what makes me wonder if the naysayers or the people that are already looking at you a little suspicious hear what you're saying, and what they're hearing under the radar is, well, wait a sec. Anybody that hears you talking and has a little bit of power might well hear what you're saying and realize, hey, if I showed up to, say, a church packed with people and gave a political speech after a worship service, and that's where I this is where I sort of use that example to say, hey, if this is something that's worrying you, this is where it could be a good thing that we're talking about this, because don't get it twisted. These folks have existed since religion was discussed. There's been people that came along and realized, hey, there's a group of people out here that if I could just convince them I was sent from their holy being, they may turn their loyalty to me. I also, though, again, wonder how much that adds to your the small amount of pushback you've got, where people hear that and they say, aren't you really saying that we're all saps? Or aren't you really saying that somebody could come along and make us all saps? Aren't you worried they'll hear your research?
Yeah, no. And this, if I may, I will go ahead and make a mythopoetic connection with the book of Genesis once again, since we kind of started there, where you have this iconic representation of the tree of knowledge. And it's like, okay, whatever you do, don't take the tree of knowledge. And again, like literally for thousands and thousands of years, there have been competing interpretations about what is this tree of knowledge? What does this mean? What is it meant to signify in the text? But basics are that, okay, there's something about it that once you take that fruit of knowledge, like chaos ensues. So anytime, whatever it is, that technology, understanding, scientific frontiers move forward, or rather, forward is value assumptive. So when they expand, when they expand, that you have the potential for applications that can be used for malevolent outcomes or benevolent outcomes. And frankly, I agree that this is no exception when we're understanding a scientific, rational basis of spiritual instincts, dispositions, and emotions in human beings. And in fact, I'll share quite frankly that I myself have leveraged this. I like I said, I grew up in the LDS church. I've been an advocate in a number of different contexts for gender and sexual minorities, for their dignities, for their inclusion, socially, religiously. And there was a direct action that I was co-organizing in Salt Lake City one year, where we wanted to raise awareness about what's called conversion therapy. Mm-hmm. So conversion therapy, they're clinical or pseudo-clinical efforts to reorient an individual away from heterosexuality or away from gender nonconformity, into a heteronormative or a gender conforming life expression.
Such a nice way to say
Okay,
it.
so
Sorry, that was great. Yeah. Okay.
so as we were planning this direct action, though, we had little cards that we were going to be handing out, and we had a question as an organizing team. Do we want to hand these out before the big general conference meeting, or do we want to hand them out after the big general conference meeting? And we were thinking about it, and I said, aha, I actually know from my study on Mormons that once they've had a period of time where they're feeling the spirit and they're participating in religious priming, at least in our sample, they are more likely to receive positively something that is messaging from an outgroup individual. So based on that insight, we specifically planned to have our outreach timed with the end of this religious meeting as opposed to the beginning of the meeting. Whether or not that turned out in the real world to be more effective, we would have to, somehow go back in time and in an alternate universe measure outcomes. But anecdotally, I can say that the responses that we got from people were very positive.
Huh. Okay. This is sort of outside of where we're even at, but I thought about asking it earlier anyway. Was there differences between men and women in the study? I didn't see anything in the published paper. I know it's a small sample. We are talking about what, remind us, 19 in the 2018
so there were 19
study.
in this.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. You may not be surprised to learn that the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation don't really give out tons of money for studying religious emotions. And so this was very much financially bootstrapped, meaning that we scrapped together what resources we had left over from here and there in order to conduct this research. So our sample size was 19. That does not give us enough statistical power to make differences in observations analytically between men and women who were involved in the study. But I mean, your point is well taken, that would be very, very interesting to see the degree to which there are sex specific differences, and not even just in sex typical individuals, but once you start getting into intersex variations as well.
Yeah. Okay. And I as I was writing the question, I was like, I have a feeling it's going to be hard to say. It was a really small sample, but it's one of those things. You sort of hit on the social aspect. That's what I would think. I'm sure there could be some genetic variances, but my thought is that we live in a culture where our gender, it's been this way as far back as you read, but it's policed in a cool way. We're trained not only to know our gender and to know how both are performed to a T, but to never know we've been trained and to never know we know it. And for God's sake, don't talk about Fight Club, right? And it's interesting that's what I'm wondering, is if those performances and the upbringing of how that's supposed to play out plays any part in differences. But again, the sample is small.
Oh, no, absolutely. And if you've got some multi-billion-dollar listener who wants to help support that study, we can totally do that.
And it's bizarre given not only that you got this put together on the shoestring budget that you had, but also the fanfare that followed between Dawkins and the mainstream media news outlets, that no one has showed up in the heels of this to pick it up. But I think it sort of speaks to where we're at. Not only is it threatening to the status quo, to the 80% or so of people that live in this country that claim to be Christian, a large percentage might hear you and say, see, he did use it against us. But also, I don't know how you're going to get a pharmaceutical company on board, or the big players in our system and the way we've built it are people that really have no incentive to get behind you. So I think it's really cool. I'd mentioned this to Dr. Anderson too. The system has these little nooks and crannies built in, and those of us that are watching close at how power works can do exactly what you're describing. You can find a way to find important research. And if the system's there and the MRI is plugged in and you can pull 8 minutes out of one day and 12 out of the next, run the study, and what happens is often very important results that hopefully spearhead a whole movement of research in their wake.
I appreciate that. And I'll go ahead and, in the spirit of fun, throw out another speculative future direction.
Yeah.
If you do take the historical record seriously, and I do, and even the pious historical record, unquestionably there have been embellishments for a variety of reasons, many of them being impure. However, I do think that even in pious histories, you have these kernels of reality that are embedded in them that, in many cases even something as, you know, I'll say as caricaturized as Noah's flood. It's like, you know, there could have been some kind of historical relationship with
Yeah.
the Mesopotamian flood epics that are also reflected in the Gilgamesh narratives.
Yep.
Point being that I'm not one to just completely throw out any type of record from antiquity merely because it, you know, it smells like
Men.
whatever religion. Yeah, it smells like
Heterosexual men, yes.
Right. So that said, across traditions as well, you have so many counts of faith healings, miraculous healings, that even if there's a grain of reality running through these accounts, to me that indicates that for thousands of years, there has been not just a belief, but a deployment of intrinsic healing processes in the human being.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about systems of power, you're talking about, you know, monetization and financial incentives and disincentives. Like, of course, the people who are literally making billions and billions and billions of dollars monetizing a cure, they don't, like, that's not in their interest for us to really refine some type of a scientific appreciation for intrinsic healing mechanisms that have evolved in the human body.
Yeah. No, that's a good connection. I'm thinking of both Darren Brown, who's I don't know if you're familiar with his work. I think he's from England, but he does some Netflix specials where he's recently held spiritual rallies, but Marjo is the one I'm thinking of. Mary and Joseph were pushed together, and these evangelical people named their kid Marjo. He became like a 4-year-old evangelical preacher back in the 70s. By 20 years old, he had moved away from the faith. But he had realized, and he got a camera crew to follow him as he went and still ran healing conventions. And I'll be damned if people didn't get healed. And Darren Brown does the same thing. And he goes on stage and doesn't even pretend. He says, I'm not a Christian. I am not going to ask God to heal you. But what I am going to do is use the same language that I've seen successful. And I'll be damned if people don't get on stage and get healed. I've been to Benny Hinn healing conventions. He's just one of many miracle workers that sort of travel around. And I remember when I first started moving away from my religious identity, feeling like, oh, I'm going to find out these hucksters, and coming to this realization that that's not you. There are hucksters out there. Absolutely. There always will be.
Yeah.
But these folks are healed. There are people that go to Darren Brown's convention and have had their back healed, and 10 years later, their back pain's still gone. And I think that's part of what you're talking about. It might be to stretch, but when we talk about how that's tied into the human condition and evolutionary biology, I don't know where does that go, I guess?
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, and that's one of the reasons why I'm very passionate about carving out my career space at Harvard Medical School rather than, you know, in a philosophy department. No, absolutely no disrespect to philosophy departments. But I, in many ways, am an Aristotelian at heart, meaning that I want to ground the spirituality of the human being in the physical body of the human being.
Yeah.
I want these insights and these areas of emerging knowledge to have some kind of a translational application for the common good. Those are some of my really fond aspirations for doing this work. At a theoretical intellectual level, I find it useful to make a couple of categorical distinctions as we're understanding these phenomena that, particularly in our contemporary culture, seem very, very esoteric, if not, to use a really technical term, kooky. I think of things either from a natural point of view, which is to say that, okay, let's take the example of someone who has back pain, goes to one of these rallies or conventions, has a relief that is very difficult to explain from the chronic back pain. There are mechanisms when we're looking at the endogenous opioid system, when we're looking at neurochemical transmitters that block the pain gates from the peripheral nervous system into the central nervous system. There are ways to understand this that don't require us to go beyond our contemporary Western material scientific paradigms. So, that's naturalism. There's another category of ways of understanding that I refer to as hypernaturalism. And by hypernaturalism, what I mean is the ideal physical scientific explanations that presumably will be at our disposal in 500 years. So when we have a a more complete, vetted material Western understanding that has even more nooks and crannies of experience explained.
Yeah.
That I think of as hypernatural, you know, and you can go really off the deep end with that when you start talking about like 17 hyperdimensions of the physical universe, or 85% of the composition being dark matter, and what the heck is it even, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah,
so
but it all goes together.
You know?
And I think it's high time that those of us in the sciences started, or those of us in the social field started merging our fields and making sure that, especially for teachers, that we're sort of bridging these gaps, because you're talking about really important things. You're hitting at new materialism. You're talking about space-time in a weird way. These are concepts that when you say space-time, students that are in communication department think you're talking about two different things. They haven't even understood some of the basics that they should have probably been reading in middle school, but they're another on the long list of things that we've traded out for what we consider to be more important. So again, really cool connections that you're making.
And briefly, I'll say that the third category of ways of knowing I would identify as supernaturalism. And, you know, the project of science is really to understand the most peripheral phenomena, the most close to the vest observation. Like, you know, the business of science isn't to define the cosmic fractal pattern that gave rise to life and existence. I mean, I guess you could say that like cosmic physicists do that, cosmologists. Yeah.
Someday maybe, yeah.
Someday maybe, but point being that, you know, when I go into the research laboratory, it's not my mandate to solve a theological supernatural question. That's not why I'm there. I'm there to solve something much more modest and much more humble that falls into the domain of the natural, or, you know, you could say the domain where I'm trying to push the natural into what we identified as the quote unquote hypernatural. But that's not to say that we can't still have conversations with individuals and disciplines that are committed to supernatural propositions for understanding human experience and existence.
Yeah, no, well said. I think I've heard you say before something along the lines of, if somebody tried to explain that they knew what God was to you, you would already know they were full of shit, because at that point you've already sort of tried to rhetorically explain something that's not rhetorically explainable. You're trying to put something into words. And I think what you were alluding to, I don't remember what interview this was, what I stumbled on, but I loved, again, the wording was to say, there is always something that's beyond the comprehension of humans, and it might be right in front of us all the time, you idiots.
That's right. Yeah. So, and, you know, to that point, I actually look at science itself as mysticism. I see science as a form of mysticism. What we're trying to do as scientists is venture into the darkness of the unknown and illuminate it, and then experience some sort of unification with that which is currently outside of our circumference of understanding. And I'm like, if that's not mystical, I don't know what is.
Right. Yeah. So this is, again, I keep going back to your lit review at the beginning of your article, but I kept going through, and every time I've read through it, I stumble on something else. And I'm like, I wonder if he was trying to hint at that. So I do want to ask you one thing about specifically the difference between quality of life, sleep enhancement, and a few other things that, this is, again, the lit review. So this isn't your research, but it was what you felt like was necessary to frame your article before you slid people into the MRI. Religious folks across the board that have a personal relationship with Christ, or they practice prayer, or they are committed to their religion, show improved sleep and improved quality of life. But it turns out that when you look at people that speak in tongues, or they claim to have perceptions of their prayers being answered, or they claim to have experienced or witnessed miracles, like I was describing a minute ago, we can't find any correlation between their quality of life going up. And my question is, what do you make of that?
Yeah, those are complicated also by the basic scientific axiom that correlation does not equal causation.
Okay.
And so, you know, is someone drawn into a particular religious or spiritual expression because they happen to have a hippocampal anatomical wiring feature that allows them to sleep better, and therefore these things are related through some kind of third, you know, mediating variable? I'm very leery when, you know, there's a little bit too much rah for religion, in the sense of saying like, oh, look at all these amazing health variables. So therefore, we're now going to assume that we understand the causal direction or even the causal mechanism. And that's, again, that's one of the most fundamental axioms of science, is that observing a correlation is not the same thing as understanding the causation.
You just won back all of the religious folks that were listening to you thinking like, oh, I think he's using it against us. Because where I was headed was that, if, again, we've swerved into like hypothesizing a couple times. So this is the disclaimer. We're hypothesizing at best. This is not research. But what my thought was is that if I, honest to God, believed that I had some sort of access to an all-powerful being, and that I had been given like a special language to speak in tongues, or directly from this person, or that I had watched that person act on my behalf to move my car a foot to the left and avoid a head-on collision, or to heal my cancer, I'm pretty sure I'd be sleeping pretty damn good all the time, unless I wasn't really sure that I actually believed the bullshit I was saying. And that's me just saying it in a terrible way. I grew up in the church. I don't think bad of those folks, but I now look back and I know that I said out loud to anybody that would listen that I believed things that it turns out I did not believe in the moment, but there's this beautiful social network that once you enter the atmosphere, and this may be more poignant in Pentecostal, because we too tend to go all in with our belief that like right now somebody might get their leg grown back that's been amputated. None of us have ever seen it, but we all know it could happen at any time. That's where I was going. And again, I don't want to lead you into that. I actually think you made some really good points, but if you have thoughts on that, again, warning, hypothesizing here, I'd be curious if you have thought about that.
Sure. I'll answer a little bit tangentially here, which is to say that there is work that is rigorous and that has looked at behavioral correlations across religious communities, life outcomes, health outcomes. They found a lot of positive correlations. Again, you can't just assume what the causal direction is or even the causal mechanism from seeing a correlation. But I would really like to go a little bit further than that. I really want to understand the mystical encounter proper. Yeah. Because again, independent of the ultimate truth of the matter, you and I are both in agreement that there is something very powerful that occurs experientially. And as a neuroscientist, if something is occurring experientially, then that means that there is a physical basis for it that is impacting my body, it's impacting my physiology. I want to understand ways in which these experiences that we historically have identified as mystical or spiritual in nature are transforming individuals at the level of brain, which then have these long-term impacts on their behavioral trajectories and life outcomes.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it's almost a catch-22, because like you were saying, it's almost like, okay, well, if you believe, then there is some degree of a self-fulfilling dimension to some of the positive externalities.
Yeah. Okay, and I want to be cognizant of your time, but now this one's just off the cuff. This is like the third or fourth one, and reading up on you, I had a feeling we would sort of have this synergy that would make me think, oh, I should have asked him that. The way you're describing that strikes me a lot of where we're at with breaking ground research on psychedelic therapy. And I have no idea if you're even familiar with it. I know our religious backgrounds also vary a lot in what sorts of tinkering with the neurology is allowed. But what do you think about that as far as the way you're describing this mystical experience? Is that something you've looked into at all?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll speak evidentially and then anecdotally.
Yeah, great.
So evidentially, the Johns Hopkins work with psilocybin is fascinating to me, that they've been looking at cases of intractable depression and administering these psychedelic reagents and then measuring outcomes and trying to assess what are the predictors between the individuals who have relief from their depression after a psychedelic trip versus the people who basically their depression stays the same after a psychedelic trip. And the one variable that seems to be most predictive about whether an individual has relief from depression after a psychedelic trip is whether they experienced it as mystical in some way. What? Again, like we just don't have cognitive models right now that can narrate, that can encapsulate, that can convey what's going on under the hood. That if someone reports that their psychedelic trip was a mystical encounter, that their depression is relieved.
Yeah. It makes sense to some of us that grew up in the church. It makes sense. I mean, that's what's funny is, especially those of us that have had sincere, you described it as like daily spiritual experiences where you're communing with God. And I mean, I've experienced the exact same thing of sort of just being in the spirit. It isn't a surprise at all to me that that's one of the keys to breaking through. I had this moment in prison where I was just like at the end of I was in quarantine. I went to prison years ago. Sorry, there's something to just dump on you. But I'm an addicted person, so I was arrested and did some time. I got about 17 years ago. But in my first days in prison, when they have you in one-man cells for about 3 months while they're classifying you, I was just broken. I had no treatment, no medication. I already had some psychological stuff going on that hadn't been diagnosed or therapized. And I remember at one point saying, all right, God, this is a story we've all heard a bunch of times, by the way. All right, God, if you're real, you got to show me right now. And I'll be damned if like my memory tells me that at that moment and throughout the next days and throughout the next weeks, I walked in the spirit. I had this feeling of spirituality. And again, I'm referring to some of the quotes I bumped into from you from the past, but you rang my bell when you said something along the lines of the energy that you save the second you give up on trying to figure out what the hell God is a rush. It's a buzz. You free up synapsal energy to think about other things because you're so sort of caught up on it. And it sort of reminded me of that moment of being like, I don't know what's going on in my life. I don't know what God is. And finally just being broken at my end. And to tie that together, those are the moments people call like rock bottom when God shows up in your life. If the spirituality wouldn't have showed up, if I wouldn't have had this remembrance of the next day and the next week, it wouldn't have been any different. But because of that spirituality, it's sort of tied in.
Oh, my friend. Again, like, this is what I'm about to reference right now is work that is about to be submitted for peer review. And so I don't want to like, spill all the beans and then ruin a potential publication. But I'll just tease again by saying that there are some brain circuit level associations between mysticism and criminality that I think you're going to find very interesting.
Oh, we're going to have to talk again then. Cool. So you said it's already in for peer review? So it should be within, oh, good Lord, never mind. That's not a question. You never know. It comes back 5 times occasionally, but do you have any idea when it'll be ready to go?
No, but I'll keep you in the loop.
Yeah,
for sure.
Absolutely. Send me something when you get it. The final question I'll ask you, because so my podcast is basically devoted to harm reduction and the truth about things that get you high. But my goal is to let people know, like we've boxed ourselves in with just thinking of drugs this way. It's religion, it's meditation, it's mindfulness, it's holism, it's what you eat, it's sex, it's music. It's just to get this idea so that addicted people get a new lens to look through. One of the things I ask all my guests is, do you have advice for how to use our drug responsibly? And I'll reword it for you because I don't want to offend all my people that are like, it's not a drug. Do you have any advice for responsible use of religious experience or spirituality?
That's so funny. I love that you're asking it. I love the way that you framed the question. I would, gosh, how to responsibly use the drug of God? That's a great question. In some ways, that's like one of the defining questions of the human drama. And I don't think that I overstate the matter when I say it that way. Like a quick hot take. And again, this is by no means an exhaustive answer to your question, but a quick hot take is that we walk a very fine line between fixed delusion and spiritual insight. That these are brain circuits that dance with one another. And I think that the degree to which we engage our spiritual quest in community with open, honest, intellective engagement in addition to affective, emotional engagement, to me, it seems the more likely we are to have a successful outcome that doesn't end up taking us into a place of self-delusion and turmoil.
Yeah, Actually, that was impressive. That was better than I could have come up with. um, I really appreciate you taking time to sit down with me. Is there anything else? I know you got this one study and publication. Do you got anything else going on right now that you can share with us? Or I know you can't.
Quite a
I know
few
you've already
things.
ruined that one, and it won't be.
No, that's okay. That's okay. This is so. I mean, all of these things are works in progress, and particularly in this very strange COVID world that we inhabit right now,
Yeah.
institutions are getting derailed left and right. And so
Yeah.
I'm just a little bit cautious about saying this is what's going to happen in a year or two,
Yeah.
given that we live in a massive state of entropy right now.
Yeah.
But you know, I have gotten approval to launch a new course at Harvard University that's looking at the neuroscience of spirituality. Unless something gets derailed, that will be implemented in the fall of 2021. I'm thrilled about that. I'm thrilled that I have support at the medical school to pursue research that is trying to really use the best evidence-based scientific approaches to understand ways that these phenomena that seem, again, so esoteric and so difficult to pin down might be understood and applied clinically for the common good. A lot of exciting stuff is happening right now, and it does make me feel optimistic that even though the world is literally on fire, it might be a refiner's fire that takes us to a better outcome.
Yeah. And that is sort of coming to be the consensus, at least in those of us that are trying to be pessimistic. We've used the word the second civil war, and I think that the way wars are fought nowadays, they look a lot different than they used to. We didn't know Obama was flying drones over funerals or wherever he was blowing people up until weeks afterwards. And a lot of times it's fought cyberly. You take down, internet structures or people's electrical grids or whatever it is. I think that's sort of what we're seeing right now is this cultural uprising that we might all be surprised in 10 years when we get that edition of the history book and say, wait a sec. Oh yeah, we were in war. So, but a lot of folks are us that are leading the way are trying to turn this corner and be pessimistic and say, I think we hope from fire, from the ashes rises the new era. And hopefully we're more through this than that. I don't think we're at the beginning anymore. So I know that's completely off topic from where we were at, but.
I mean, we've come through a lot as a species. We've come through a lot.
We got a long way to go.
And in some ways it's it's hubris to think that we have the power to break the chain that has been strong and unbroken up to now. I mean, I don't want to sound overly confident because God forbid we break the chain. But point being that we've come through a lot, and I think that we're strong, we're smart, we're resilient, we're creative, and we can go through a lot.
Yeah. No, that's a great way. That's a great spot to end this on a positive note. I do want to make sure we talk in the future when that comes out. Get a hold of me. It'd be great to sit down with you again and talk about what you find out about that. But I really appreciate you taking the time to unpack some of what you've done in this field of religious experience and trying to understand it.
Thank you so much. This was a pleasure.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Dr. Ferguson. I'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good.